Probably bought her credentials online. That's what Dr. Pierce said about Natalie Hayes at 6:27 a.m., standing at the Cedar Creek medical vending machine with his hand wrapped around a bottle of San Pellegrino that cost more than her shift differential. He didn't know she was 3 corridors away, hand steady as surgical steel while checking me for of a man he'd never bothered to learn the name of. He didn't know that the woman in the discount scrubs had once held a man's intestines together with her own hands while helicopters circled overhead. The Pentagon called her something else back then. They all did. The ICU smells like antiseptic and floor wax under fluorescent lights that hum at exactly 60 Hz, a frequency Natalie has learned to tune out like ambient noise, the way soldiers learn to sleep through artillery. She moves through Cedar Creek's 3rd floor at 0600 hours with the kind of economy of motion that comes from years of practice, the kind that makes her invisible in a hospital full of people. Her scrubs are from a discount chain, the kind with the slightly faded logo after 15 washes, and her shoes are white Crocs she paid $19.99 for at a big box store. Everything about her is designed to disappear into the background of a busy medical floor. Room 347 is where the mute patient sleeps, or tries to. Marcus Webb. Retired Navy SEAL, 47 years old, throat marked with a surgical scar that runs from his left ear to his collarbone, shrapnel wound from Helmand Province, 2009, the kind of injury that steals a man's voice but not his eyes. Those eyes track Natalie's movements with the hypervigilance of someone who has learned that the people who notice small details are the people who live. She's seen that look before. She's worn it. She enters his room at 0603, already knowing what she'll find. The foresight on his right hand shows the early signs of irritation, slight redness at the insertion point, the kind of thing other nurses might miss on a quick rounds assessment. Natalie doesn't miss things. She pulls the rolling stool closer and sits without asking permission, which is itself a violation of hospital protocol, the unspoken hierarchy that places doctors above nurses, nurses above patients, and everyone above the person who is simply good at what they do. "This one's done," she says, her voice pitched low enough that it doesn't carry beyond the room's closed door. She's already preparing anew for setup before the words are fully out of her mouth, movements precise as a concert pianist. Alcohol pad. Tourniquet. The 18-gauge needle inserted at a perfect 15-degree angle into the basilic vein. No fumbling. No hesitation. No tremor in hands that have held too much. Webb watches her with an intensity that goes beyond patient observation. His notebook is on his lap tray, the pen clipped to the spiral binding, but he doesn't reach for it. Some things don't need to be written down. Some recognitions happen in the space between people who have stood on the same piece of ground and watched others die. Natalie tapes the new line down with practiced efficiency and checks the pump settings, 15 milliliters per hour, just as ordered, but she's already catalogued that his urine output has been slightly elevated and makes a mental note to mention it to the attending. If she's allowed to. If anyone listens. The machines around Webb's bed emit their soft symphony of beeping and hissing, the ventilator that helps his scarred lungs process air, the cardiac monitor displaying the steady rhythm of a warrior's heart, the 4-pump clicking its mechanical rhythm like a metronome counting down time. She touches the equipment with the kind of reverence most people reserve for prayer. It's muscle memory, this attention to detail. It's also evidence. Evidence that she knows things. Evidence that her hands have done things that you can't learn in the Community College of Savannah's nursing program. Her fingers find the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, camouflage fabric the color of sand and dust, barely visible unless you know where to look, when she thinks no one is watching. She touches it the way other women touch wedding rings, the only proof she's ever existed in that other life. The only proof that Captain Natalie Hayes was ever real. The patch is smaller than a postage stamp. Olive drab. It bears the insignia of Naval Special Warfare Group 3, sewn into the lining of her white coat back when she had a different name on her personnel files, back when the government still acknowledged that she existed. Now it's just a scrap of fabric that smells like old fabric and dust and memories classified deeper than anyone's need to know. The shift continues with the rhythm Natalie has learned over 15 months at Cedar Creek. Vital signs. Medication checks. The careful dance of not appearing to know anything that might require explanation. not appearing to notice that the medication dose Dr. Pierce ordered yesterday was 15% above safe limits until an intern asked a quiet question that Natalie didn't actually ask but somehow happened to be nearby when the calculation was revisited. Not appearing to see the surgical error in the pre-op notes that would have resulted in wrong-site surgery if she hadn't made sure the mark was placed on the correct location while the patient was still awake and able to confirm. These are the things that make men like Dr. Pierce dangerous. Not the things they know. The things they don't know about the people they've already dismissed. She passes his station at 08 for 7, and that's when she hears it. The vending machine on the third-floor break room has a particular metallic clang when someone selects a beverage, and it's followed by the unmistakable voice of Dr. Samuel Pierce, attending surgeon, Yale medical degree, the kind of man whose confidence is proportional to his inheritance and inversely proportional to his actual competence. He's with Savannah, the charge nurse, and his voice carries the particular pitch of someone who believes he's delivering important intelligence. The new hire. Hayes. Where exactly did we find this one? Pierce's tone suggests he's asking a genuine question, but everyone within earshot knows it's an execution. Her reference is checked out, but barely. Community college. No specialty certification. And I pulled her file. Look at the way she documents. Too detailed. Too medical. Honestly, the way she moves around the ICU. He pauses, taking a sip of water that costs more than Natalie's shift differential. Probably bought the whole credential package online somewhere. There are websites for that now. Entire fake identities. Natalie is past them by then, heading toward the medication dispensary on the opposite end of the floor, her pace unchanged. Not faster. Not slower. A person with nothing to hide wouldn't accelerate, and Natalie learned long ago that the secret to invisibility isn't being quiet. It's being boring. It's being so utterly unremarkable that people look through you instead of at you. She's wearing her composure like a second skin, the way she wore night vision goggles through the hills of Helmand, and the only sign that she heard anything at all is the slight tightening of her jaw, the kind of micro-expression that would only be visible to someone trained to read faces under starlight. The night shift comes that evening, and Natalie stays an extra 30 minutes, which isn't protocol but also isn't unusual. The ICU is a 24-hour operation, and continuity of care isn't something that waits for policy manuals. She documents her notes with the meticulous precision that has gotten her into this situation in the first place. The thing about being trained to observe under conditions where missing a detail means someone dies is that you can't really turn it off. Not in the ICU. Not anywhere. By the time she reaches her apartment at 2024 Livingston Avenue, a one-bedroom where the walls are painted the color of institutional oatmeal and the rent is $850 a month, the light is already fading from the Savannah sky. She hangs her scrubs on the shower rod, white Crocs still wet from the hand-washing station, jacket still smelling of hospital disinfectant and human pain, and stands in her kitchen with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from relaxation but from the careful management of emotions that might crack her open if she let them. She sits on the edge of her bed, no wall clock, no television, no evidence of a life that extends beyond the basic requirements for survival. The jacket is on the chair beside her, and her hand finds the inside lining without needing to see it. The patch. The proof. The only thing connecting her to the woman she used to be before the black operation that went sideways in Helmand province, before the government's need to protect classified information meant erasing everyone involved, before she became a nurse with community college credentials and no specialty certifications and hands that somehow know exactly how to save lives. The fluorescent lights of her apartment buzz at the same frequency as the ones at Cedar Creek, and that similarity, that connection between the place where she works and the place where she tries to pretend she sleeps, is its own kind of torture. She touches the unit patch and remembers the sand and the blood and the voice of Marcus Webb, back when he could still use his voice, saying, "Get to the bird, Angel." The bird's hot, and she runs. But the phone doesn't ring. Not yet. The Pentagon is still hours away. For now, there is only the patch and the silence and the knowledge that in 6 hours, she'll put on the discount scrubs again and disappear back into the walls of Cedar Creek Medical, where a man with an Ivy League degree and a $12,000 watch has already decided that she's a fraud. What he doesn't know is that he's already made a mistake. The Grand Rounds conference room at Cedar Creek Medical held the weight of 17 years of hierarchy stacked into tiered seating. 12 nurses occupied the middle rows, 5 residents clustered in the back where mistakes felt safer to witness. Dr. Pierce stood at the podium like a man who'd never questioned his own stage, patient charts fanned in his hands like evidence of crimes he was about to prosecute. "This," Pierce announced, holding up Natalie's documentation for room 347 with 2 fingers, as if the paper itself might contaminate him, "is what happens when we let undertrained staff pretend to play doctor." The fluorescent lights hummed their institutional song. Natalie stood against the far wall where she always stood during Grand Rounds, present but not present, visible but forgettable. She felt the shift in the room's air pressure the way combat medics feel incoming rounds before they hear them. Pierce read from her notes with theatrical precision, each word chosen for maximum condescension. Patient presenting with post-surgical wound integrity concerns. He paused, letting the silence work. Concerns. Not complications. Not what we might call clinical deterioration. He looked up at the residents. Notice the language choices here. Imprecise. Defensive. The work of someone whose credentials came from a website rather than a classroom. Natalie's jaw tightened. Nothing else moved. The reason for his performance walked past the podium 3 weeks ago, an intern named Castellano, barely old enough to shave, holding a medication order that would have stopped a patient's heart. A decimal point error. Pierce's handwriting, Pierce's carelessness, Pierce's prescription pad. Natalie had stepped forward quietly. "Doctor, that's 10 micrograms, not 100. Said it in front of the intern. Said it in front of the charge nurse. The kind of correction that couldn't be unseen, couldn't be repositioned as a mistake on anyone else's part. Men like Pierce kept ledgers for moments like that. They called it reputation management. Furthermore, he continued, his voice carrying across the tiered seating like a closing argument, the interventions documented here suggest a scope of practice that exceeds nursing protocols by a significant margin. Almost as if Nurse Hayes believes she's the physician in this scenario. He set the chart down with deliberate care. Which brings us to the question of credential verification. Has anyone in this room considered requesting her references? Verifying them directly? The other nurses shifted in their seats. Not dramatically. Just enough for Natalie to register the movement without looking at them. The way a seal reads water displacement to know where the current is taking you. Natalie's hands remained at her sides, steady as surgical steel. The rest of Grand Rounds continued, 3 more cases, 2 resident presentations, 1 discussion about protocol updates that nobody would remember. Pierce had made his point. The room had absorbed it the way antiseptic absorbs into gauze. Natalie left when the session dismissed, moving through the corridors of Cedar Creek Medical with the kind of purposeful invisibility that comes from 17 years of knowing exactly where you are and exactly how many footsteps it takes to get anywhere else. Her shift had ended at 0700. She wasn't scheduled to return until 1900. 12 hours between now and the moment she'd have to put on the discount scrubs again and disappear back into the walls. She didn't go home. Instead, she went to the 3rd floor break room, where the vending machine stood in the corner like a mechanical confessor. She inserted 4 quarters for the darkest coffee the machine offered, burnt, lukewarm, exactly what she deserved. The coins clinked down the chute with the sound of finality. You know what the problem is with people like Hayes. Natalie's spine didn't stiffen. Her hand didn't pause on the coffee cup dispensing into the paper cup with the sound of liquid disappointment. She'd positioned herself deliberately in this corner, had seen the reflection of the break room entrance in the chrome surface of the microwave seconds before Pierce and charge nurse Martinez entered through the door behind her. The ones who buy their credentials online, Pierce continued, his voice carrying that particular confidence of a man accustomed to being overheard, they have a smell about them. You know what I mean? Something about the way they document. The way they move. He lowered his voice to what he considered confidential. I'm wondering if we should verify her references directly. Pull them, call them, make sure she didn't steal someone's actual identity to get hired here. Natalie lifted the coffee cup. Steam rose from it in a thin ribbon that caught the fluorescent light. She turned, past them with 3 feet of distance, enough to acknowledge the corridor's social geometry without engaging it, and left the break room. Behind her, she heard Martinez say something soft. Pierce's response was a laugh that sounded like glass breaking inside a confined space. The poison spread through Cedar Creek Medical the way hospital infections always spread, quietly, through contact, through the small viral moments of conversation that happened at medication dispensers and computer terminals and sink basins during hand washing. By 1500, at least 6 nurses had made eye contact with her that lasted 1 beat too long. By 1600, the charge nurse on the evening shift, someone Natalie had worked alongside for 7 years, suddenly became very absorbed in her computer screen when Natalie passed. Pierce's words didn't need to be true. They needed to be possible. And possibility was a weapon. Natalie's shift began at 1900. She picked up her room assignments, room 312, room 341, room 347. The last one was Marcus Webb's room. The retired Navy SEAL who'd taken shrapnel to the throat in Helmand Province, 2009, 3rd deployment. The man who couldn't speak but could write. The man who'd been the one to step into her exact role after the operation went sideways and the Pentagon buried everyone involved. She'd been deleted. He'd been promoted. That was how the machinery worked. She didn't acknowledge the machinery when she entered room 347 at 20:15 hours. She simply began her rounds, for line integrity check, medication verification, wound assessment on his throat where the scar tissue had formed into something that looked like a map of decisions made under fire. His vitals were stable. O2 sat 96. Heart rate 72. Temperature 37.1. Normal. Webb's eyes tracked her as she moved through the clinical assessment. His hand reached for the notepad on his bedside table. "Don't," Natalie said quietly, moving to his foreline and checking the saline drip rate with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory operating at a level beneath conscious thought. "Don't say anything that might be overheard." His hand stopped. She adjusted the 4 rate, nothing different, just a small confirmation that the line was patent, flowing properly, doing what lines were supposed to do. His eyes held hers for exactly 4 seconds. Then he set down the notepad and nodded. It was exactly 20:47 when Drive Pierce appeared in the doorway of room 347. "Nurse Hayes," he said, his tone carrying that particular blend of condescension and performance, "I need to discuss your scope of practice." Natalie turned from the vital signs monitor, her jaw set in a way that suggested she'd been waiting for this conversation. Her hands remained steady. Not calm, steady. There was a difference. Calm was what people who'd never lost control pretended to feel. Steady was what your hands did when the alternative was destruction. "Your interventions with this patient exceed what nursing protocols allow," Pierce continued, stepping into the room with the posture of a man who'd never been contradicted and had come to trust that dynamic. "The way you manage his care. It's too directive. Too much like you think you're the physician." Webb's eyes moved between them like a man watching chess pieces on a board where the rules had changed and nobody'd bothered to tell him. "I'm going to be direct," Pierce said, his voice dropping to a register he apparently thought was threatening. "If you don't learn your place in the medical hierarchy at Cedar Creek, I'll have security escort you out of this hospital. Is that clear, Nurse Wikipedia?" Natalie didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Didn't allow a single muscle in her face to register anything beyond professional acknowledgement. Her jaw tightened by perhaps a millimeter, the kind of micro-expression that would only be visible to someone trained to see it. Her hands remained at her sides. "Crystal clear, Doctor," she said, her voice flat as a rifle shot. "I'll remember my place." Pierce stood in the doorway for 4 seconds longer, waiting for something, tears, apology, the sight of his impact landing. When none of those things materialized, he turned and left room 347, his footsteps moving down the corridor with the sound of a man who delivered a performance and believed he'd won. Webb reached for his notepad again. Natalie put her hand on his wrist, gentle but immovable. "Don't," she said again. "Not here. Not now." She finished her rounds at 2,300 hours. Checked on 3 other patients, documented everything in the hospital's electronic system with meticulous precision, and then drove home to her apartment in Savannah, where the walls knew her only as the woman who appeared at night and left before dawn. She sat on the floor of her bedroom at 01 for 5 hours, pulling her jacket from the closet where she'd hung it at 1900, and pressed her fingers against the inside lining where the faded unit patch had been sewn with stitches so small and precise they were almost invisible. SEAL Team 3. Charlie Platoon. The designation that meant she'd been real once. Meant she'd held lives together with hands that knew what they were doing. Meant that somewhere in classified files at the Pentagon, there was a record of her existence that nobody was ever supposed to find. The patch felt warm under her fingertips. Or maybe that was just her blood heat returning to her skin after spending 12 hours holding it down. She lay on her bed in the dark, listening to Savannah move outside her windows, traffic sounds, distant sirens, the thrum of a city that didn't know a Navy SEAL with a scarred throat was lying 3 miles away in a hospital bed, writing messages nobody would ever read, while the woman who'd trained alongside him for 8 years before the black operation erased both their names folded her jacket and prepared for the next shift. The quiet stretched between them like an ocean. The code blue alarm screamed through the ICU at 0200 hours like a siren that had been waiting all shift to announce the inevitable. Room 347. Marcus Webb's monitor showed what no monitor should ever show, a flat line preceded by the violent chaotic flutter of a heart losing its war against internal hemorrhage. His sutured abdominal wounds had ruptured. The bleeder they'd missed during initial imaging was now painting his insides crimson, his blood pressure collapsing like a building in demolition, dropping from 95 to 78 to 62 in the space of 4 minutes while the night resident stood frozen at the bedside, his hands trembling in a way that suggested this was the moment he realized medical school had not prepared him for the sound of a human body shutting down. Natalie was moving before the code team even assembled, her body remembering what her military records claimed she'd never learned. She didn't run. Running looked panicked. She walked with the kind of controlled urgency that made the nursing staff part like water, their eyes tracking her without understanding why they obeyed the quiet girl everyone had dismissed as overqualified for bedside work. The night charge nurse watched her cross the threshold into room 347 and something flickered across her face, recognition of a competence that didn't match the official narrative. Natalie called out for equipment with the voice of someone used to being followed, not questioned. Thoracotomy tray. Now. And get me a 14-gauge needle, chest tubes, 2 units of O-negative uncrossed. The resident blinked. She didn't soften it, didn't say please. Did I stutter, doctor? The room erupted into motion because her voice carried the weight of command, the kind of authority that can only come from having given orders when orders meant the difference between someone breathing and someone bleeding out in the sand. The surgical resident moved toward the phone to call up to the OR, but Natalie was already positioning herself at Webb's bedside, her hands already moving with the muscle memory of 8 years she wasn't supposed to have. She assessed the abdomen in 2 seconds flat, distended, rigid, the surgical sites leaking dark blood through the dressings. The internal bleeding had accelerated beyond anything the post-op protocols could contain. The surgical team wouldn't arrive for another 9 minutes. Webb didn't have 9 minutes. His heart rate was climbing past 140, his pressure dropping past 55, his pupils dilating in that way that meant his brain was screaming for oxygen it wasn't getting. Pain is data. Her hands gathered what they needed before conscious thought caught up, the thoracotomy tray materializing before her like she'd simply summoned it from wherever her erased past kept its supplies. Down the hallway in the nursing station, Dr. Pierce stood watching the monitor feeds when Webb's oxygen saturation began its freefall. He stared at the climbing heart rate, the collapsing pressure, and for exactly 2.3 seconds his face was a landscape of confusion. His network of influence, his board member relationships, his carefully cultivated reputation, none of it meant anything against arterial hemorrhage. None of it could stop a patient from bleeding to death. He pulled out his phone with the expression of a man realizing that this moment might actually require him to be a doctor, but by then Natalie was already cracking Webb's chest. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for permission. She made the incision, left anterolateral thoracotomy, her blade moving with surgical precision through skin that had already been scarred by worse, and when the surgical resident whispered, "He didn't authorize this." "We need attending authorization," Natalie's voice came out flat and final. "He's exsanguinating. Help or get out." The resident helped. Her hands moved into the open thorax with the kind of fluid precision that only comes from having done this in a forward operating base, with mortar fire walking closer with each round, with a medic's headlamp her only light, with a soldier's life depending on her fingers finding the right artery before the bleeding found his brain. She found the descending aorta where it should be, where it was pumping Webb's life out onto the table, and her fingers applied direct pressure with the terrifying calmness of someone who had already survived the worst and knew that panic was just another way to fail. Suction. The resident worked like his hands were connected to her thoughts. Clamp. She was guiding his movements now, instructing the night resident in a voice that made him forget to be afraid, giving him permission to be part of something that transcended protocol. The surgical lights flooded the room with a brightness that turned everything clinical and precise, and Natalie's hands disappeared into Webb's open chest cavity with the intimate knowledge of someone who'd held lives together in much darker places than this. She could feel his aorta responding to her pressure, the feedback of a vessel under stress, the subtle tremor of blood that wanted to flow but couldn't because her fingers wouldn't allow it. 7 minutes. That's what she bought him. 7 minutes of held breath and direct manual control, keeping his core perfused while his nervous system screamed in ways the drugs they were pushing couldn't fully suppress. The resident had called the OR. The surgical team was already moving. 2 minutes out. Then 90 seconds. The surgical attending burst through the door with the charge nurse, and Natalie released the aorta only when the vascular clamp was in place, when the attending's hands could take over, when Webb was no longer dying because someone's fingers had decided to hold him back from the edge. But that wasn't the worst part. That was the moment everything changed, the moment that Pierce, standing in the hallway watching her face on the monitor feed during the procedure, began making phone calls. His voice was low and measured when he punched the first number. The hospital CEO, Marcus Brennan, pulled out of sleep at 0217. "We have a critical incident. Unauthorized procedure. An ICU nurse performing a thoracotomy without physician oversight. I stopped her as soon as I realized, but the damage is done. We're looking at a serious liability exposure and potentially a direct threat to patient safety." The second call went to the hospital administrator, James Thornton. "I've been documenting her practice patterns for weeks. This is the escalation I was concerned about. We need security and HR in the ICU immediately." By the time Webb was rolling up to the surgical suite at 0235, Dr. Pierce had already had conversations with 3 board members, had already planted the word dangerous, had already weaponized her competence into her liability. The surgical team saved Webb's life in the OR for the next 3.5 hours, but Natalie's hands had done the work that made it possible, had bought the time that made the difference. The surgery notes would show a successful repair of a mesenteric artery rupture, a resection of perforated bowel, a return to stable vitals. What they wouldn't show was her. What they couldn't show was that the woman who cracked his chest and held his aorta while calling out instructions like a combat medic had done something that Pierce couldn't tolerate. She had demonstrated a level of competence that made it impossible to maintain the fiction that she was an online credential fraud. She had proven something worse, from his perspective. She had proven that she knew things she wasn't supposed to know, that her hands had muscle memory they shouldn't have, that underneath the compliant nurse was something far more dangerous to his institutional authority. By 0400, Pierce had sent a formal incident report to hospital administration documenting her performance of an unauthorized procedure. By 0600, he'd retrieved her personnel file and began cross-referencing her credentials with the references she'd listed on her application. The references were spotless, glowing recommendations from training institutions, from previous employers, all of it legitimate because the government had constructed a perfect false identity when they erased her real one. But Pierce wasn't looking for truth. He was looking for inconsistencies, for reasons to question, for ammunition. By 0800, he had hospital investigators requesting background verification on her nursing licenses from the state board. By 0900, security had been instructed to monitor her access to patient records. By 1,000, rumors were moving through the hospital like a contagion. The ICU nurse had performed surgery without authorization. The ICU nurse had falsified credentials. The ICU nurse was being investigated for identity theft. Natalie moved through the remainder of her shift with the kind of composure that only confused people more. She charted normally. She responded to other codes with appropriate deference to the attending physicians. She acted like someone who had done nothing wrong, which was the most threatening thing she could have done because it meant she wasn't apologetic, wasn't defensive, wasn't giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. The charge nurse who had made eye contact with her during the crisis now wouldn't make eye contact at all. The residents who had watched her work avoided the hallway when she appeared. By the time she clocked out at 0700, a red flag had been placed on her employee file. By 1400, when HR called her into an administrative conference room with 2 security officers positioned by the door, the termination letter was already printed on hospital letterhead. The charge nurse, Andrea, delivered it with the apologetic whisper of someone who had already decided to believe whatever version didn't require her to stand on principle. We've received documentation suggesting discrepancies in your credential verification process. Until this can be resolved, Cedar Creek Medical has decided to terminate your employment effective immediately. You'll need to collect your personal items with security present. Natalie read the letter without blinking, her hand steady enough to have scored a 10 in any surgical competency evaluation, her voice level enough that no one in that room could have guessed that she was watching the last 6 months of institutional belonging disappear like smoke. 30 minutes to clear her locker. Security standing 3 feet away watching her remove her personal items, a photo of her unit from 8 years ago that she'd never brought to work, a coffee mug, a sweater she'd forgotten in a drawer. The photo stayed face down against her chest until she reached her car. She drove to Cedar Creek Medical's basement laundry facility even though her shift was over, even though she had no authorization, because she needed to hold the one ritual that still made sense. In the fluorescent hum of the industrial washers, she folded her scrubs, the ones with Cedar Creek Medical's name stitched across the chest in thread that had started to fray. She'd worn these scrubs for 187 shifts. She'd held compression to bleeders in these scrubs. She'd comforted patients in these scrubs. She'd been accepted as competent and trusted and part of something in these scrubs, right up until the moment she'd been too competent, too trusted, and therefore too threatening to a man who'd built his identity on being the smartest person in every room. The laundry room was quiet except for the hiss and thud of the machines, and when Natalie set her folded scrubs on top of the washer and walked out into the Savannah evening, the rain had started, heavy and deliberate, the kind of rain that felt like the sky was making a point. She had no idea what was about to arrive. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause, each drop hitting with the same deliberate rhythm, and inside Cedar Creek Medical, Dr. Pierce stood in the hallway outside the trauma bay with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice smooth as motor oil. "Yes, I understand the optics, but we have a serious credential fraud situation developing," he said, his free hand gesturing as though the board members could see him through the phone line. "A nurse performing an authorized thoracotomy on a critical patient. That's not compassion, that's recklessness. That's liability." He paced, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the tile in measured intervals, each step calculated to project confidence he didn't feel. Inside the trauma bay, Natalie's hands moved through space with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, which she had, though not in a hospital, and not in any documented file. Her fingers held pressure on the descending aorta while the surgical team rushed in, her voice steady as surgical steel, sinus rhythm. "She's holding." The surgeons exchanged a glance, not gratitude, not yet, just professional acknowledgement of competence. By the time the surgical team had Webb fully prepped and Natalie stepped back to let them work, Pierce had already hung up with the board and made 3 more calls. To investigators. To administrators. To people who could turn her career into ash. By 0600 hours, as dawn broke grey and indifferent over Savannah, Pierce's machinery had fully activated. He sat in his office with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, a contact list spread across his desk, and a narrative already hardening into institutional fact. The references Natalie had been given when the Pentagon erased her, the fake ones, the only ones she could safely use, were being called one by one. Yes, I'm attempting to verify employment dates for a Natalie Hayes, he told the number that connected to a disconnected office building. We're conducting a credentialing review. The silence on the other end was the silence of a number that no longer existed, a reference that had been deliberately constructed to dissolve under pressure. He hung up and smiled, because every dead reference would be another nail. He contacted the state nursing board himself, suggesting they might want to investigate whether the credentials were authentic. He called 2 investigators who owed him favors, men who understood that sometimes the paperwork didn't need to match the truth as long as the paperwork looked official, and told them to build a file. Credential theft. Identity fraud. Dangerous imposter. By the time Natalie was reading the termination notice in the HR office at 1,400 hours, the architecture of her destruction was already solid concrete. The words on the letter didn't register individually. They registered as a weight. Unauthorized medical procedure. Violation of scope of practice. Credential verification concerns. Immediate termination, effective immediately. A security officer stood near the door, hands neutral, eyes trained on the middle distance the way security officers are trained when they're making sure someone doesn't make a scene. Natalie read the letter twice, her jaw tight enough to crack teeth, and signed the separation paperwork without comment. They took her badge. They pulled her from the system. They walked her through the loading dock so the afternoon shift wouldn't see her leaving in the middle of a termination, and Dr. Pierce watched from his office window on the 2nd floor, phone already raised, already making another call to ensure she never worked in medical in Savannah again. The rain was still falling. It hadn't stopped since dawn, as though the sky itself was weeping for something it had just lost. The basement laundry room of Cedar Creek Medical smelled like industrial detergent and bleach, a sharp chemical burn that cut through everything else. The machines thundered around her, commercial washers the size of small cars, industrial dryers that sounded like they were eating metal. A housekeeping supervisor named Marcia stood by the folding table, making sure Natalie didn't take anything she wasn't supposed to. Not that there was anything to take. Just the scrubs. Just the uniform of a life that had ended at 1,400 hours. Natalie folded each piece with military precision, military corners, crisp edges, the kind of folds that came from 16 years of muscle memory that predated Cedar Creek by a decade and a half. She folded the scrub top. She folded the scrub pants. She folded the white compression socks that she'd bought on her own dime because Cedar Creek didn't provide them. Each fold was a small goodbye. The Cedar Creek Medical logo, a stylized lighthouse in teal blue, faced up from every piece. A brand of shame across the chest. Her hands didn't shake. Her face showed nothing. But when she removed her employee badge from the lanyard around her neck and set it on top of the folded scrubs, something broke behind her eyes that only she knew was there. The badge had a photo of her from 3 years ago, her hair shorter then, her face still carrying the weight of someone who'd just built an entire civilian life from rubble. The name on the badge read Natalie Hayes, RN. Registered nurse. No rank. No history. No proof of what she'd actually been, what she'd actually done. She set it down with the same care someone might use handling a casket. She sat on the concrete floor between 2 humming washing machines, her back against one of them, its vibrations traveling up her spine like a pulse. The unit patch was in her jacket still, sewn into the lining where it had stayed for 16 years. She pulled the jacket from her locker, her civilian jacket, the one with the hidden evidence, and touched the patch through the fabric. Faded now. The colors running where sweat and rain and time had worn at the stitching. It was olive drab with a gold border, the emblem of Task Force Sentinel, Naval Special Operations. The word stitched in thread so fine you had to know it was there to see it, Malachi El Saar. Angel of the Desert. That's what they'd called her in Helmand Province. Not by her name. By her call sign. Because official names don't exist in classified operations. Because some things are too dark to document. Because when a black operation goes sideways and people die and the Pentagon decides the casualties need to stay buried, they erase the witnesses right along with the bodies. The Pentagon had ordered her to disappear. Captain Natalie Hayes, United States Navy Medical Corps, had been erased from every official database on the morning of August 14, 16 years ago. They'd given her a new identity. A civilian resume. Credentials from a community college in Nebraska that no longer existed. References that were carefully constructed to verify and then immediately fail under any serious investigation. They told her never to surface. Never to claim her service. Never to acknowledge that Captain Natalie Hayes had ever existed. The official story was that she'd been killed in action. Her family had been given a closed casket. A flag. A gold star. She'd watched her own funeral from a coffee shop in Arlington, Virginia, wearing dark glasses and a wig, knowing that if she blinked wrong or moved wrong or survived wrong, they'd have to erase her again. This time for real. She'd kept the unit patch anyway. It was the only proof. The only thing that said she'd been more than a ghost walking through civilian life. The only evidence that Captain Natalie Hayes had saved 17 coalition soldiers and 3 enemy combatants in a single engagement. That she'd held Marcus Webb's life in her hands once before, when he was bleeding out in a canyon in San Juan Valley with an artery severed by shrapnel. That she'd held the lives of people whose names she could never speak, whose stories she could never tell, who would never acknowledge that she'd ever existed at all. Saving Webb had been a mistake. She'd known it the moment her hands remembered what they were supposed to do, the moment muscle memory took over and she moved with the precision of someone who'd trained to keep apex predators breathing in a forward operating base medical tent. She'd known that showing competence at that level, performing a procedure that only a handful of people in the country could execute under those conditions, was going to trigger something she couldn't take back. The Pentagon had rules. Very clear rules. If you surfaced, if you showed yourself, if you proved that you were something more than the civilian identity they'd constructed for you, they had protocols. She'd broken protocol the moment she'd cracked Marcus Webb's chest open. The fluorescent lights above the laundry room buzzed like insects trapped in plastic. The dryers continued their mechanical thunder. The housekeeping supervisor, Marcia, watched from her station with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to ask questions. Natalie folded the last of her scrubs and set them in the return bin. Cedar Creek Medical would launder them and issue them to the next nurse hired to replace her. The lighthouse logo would fade with washing and wear, the way all things fade when they're used up. She stood, moving with the same controlled grace that had kept her alive in a canyon in Helmand Province. She didn't reach out to steady herself on any of the machines. She didn't let the concrete floor slow her down. She moved like someone made of steel that had learned long ago to never bend. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 5 days later, when a federal prisoner arrived at Cedar Creek Medical in a transport van, escorted by U.S. Marshals, a man with a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw, a former Taliban commander named Khalid Madad who'd been involved in operations along the Pakistan border. The worst part came when he walked past room 347 on the way to surgery and saw Marcus Webb awake in his bed, recovering from a thoracotomy that had been performed by someone who'd been officially erased from existence 16 years ago. The worst part was what would happen when that man recognized her. The worst part was knowing that she'd just become something far more dangerous than a fraud with fake credentials. She'd just become a loose thread the Pentagon couldn't afford to have anyone pull. The stretcher wheeled through Cedar Creek's corridor at 03 for 7 hours with 2 marshals on either side, the patient handcuffed to the bed rail despite acute appendicitis that would kill him in 12 hours without surgery. The former Taliban commander, detained in Savannah as a refugee asylum case pending review, had been triaged to pre-op when his eyes found her. Natalie was standing at Marcus Webb's bedside 2 rooms down, checking his chest tube output, when she felt the weight of that stare like a laser sight crossing her shoulders. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The whisper came anyway, urgent and fractured, cutting through the ventilator hum, Malak al-Sa'a. Angel of the Desert. The only name anyone in Helmand Province had called her when she was something other than a nurse pretending to fold linens. Security moved immediately. "Sir, you need to be quiet, now," but Marcus Webb's hand shot out like a reflex, his fingers closing around a pen before the guards could react. His notebook was on the bedside table. His hands, scarred and still bandaged from the internal bleeding Natalie had stopped with a combat knife and her own steady fingers 7 days ago, moved with the precision of a man who'd spent 2 decades learning to communicate through pain. He wrote furiously. 3 lines. Then he ripped the page and pressed it toward the nearest guard, his jaw working silently, that throat still reconstructing itself from shrapnel that had taken his voice in 2009. The guard read the note. His expression changed. He stepped backward and spoke into his radio. 60 seconds later, the Marine Corps liaison arrived with a citation folder pressed against his dress blues. Behind him came a 2-star general, tall enough that the corridor seemed to shrink around him, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change just by entering a room. The general didn't ask permission. He saluted Marcus Webb. Fist to chest, held for 3 seconds while the marshals exchanged confused glances and Natalie's hands went still on the 4 line. Webb reached for his bedside bag, the personal items they'd returned after surgery, and withdrew a sealed envelope. Inside were medals. Not copies. Real ones. A bronze star caught the fluorescent light first. Then came a silver star, its ribbon still showing the crease marks from being folded for 14 years. 2 purple hearts followed. And finally, a navy cross in its original presentation case, the navy blue velvet worn soft from handling. Webb held each one steady and placed them in the general's hands. The liaison opened his folder. His voice was regulation quiet, the kind of controlled tone used in formal military proceedings. Captain Natalie Hayes, Silver Star recipient. He paused. Nobody moved. The marshals' hands had dropped from their weapons. 17 combat saves in Helm and Province, classified direct action operations, officially erased from service records by executive order in 2009 following a politically sensitive incident. He turned a page. Service record top secret SCI. Any standard background check would have returned falsified information by design, a security measure implemented to protect deep cover operatives. The former Taliban commander's head turned toward Natalie. Recognition bloomed across his face like blood in water. She still didn't look at him. A Pentagon representative stepped forward from behind the general, a woman in civilian clothes carrying a tablet that glowed with the kind of government seal that made the hospital's afternoon light seem dim by comparison. Her voice was steady. Captain Hayes' actual service record is being declassified by executive order as of 17:32 hours this morning. All falsified documentation generated for her civilian cover has been marked as such in federal databases. Any institution that received fraudulent credential verification will be notified by the Department of Defense. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the fluorescent light seemed to hum louder. Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway. He'd been paged, someone said, and his face drained of color so completely that for a moment Natalie wondered if he was having a cardiac event. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. I was protecting patient safety. I had no way to know, but the FBI agents were already in the hallway behind him, pulling tablet computers from their briefcases, movements precise and efficient as surgical strikes. One of them held up a stack of printed emails. Dr. Richard Pierce, we're executing a warrant to seize your office electronic devices and all stored communications as part of an investigation into obstruction of federal justice and falsification of documents related to a protected operative. The agent's tone was exactly the one you used when someone had already made their last mistake. You have the right to remain silent. The hospital administrator appeared within minutes, legal counsel in tow. The kind of rapid response that meant Cedar Creek Medical's lawyers had been on speed dial since the Pentagon's first call. Pierce was suspended immediately. His hospital privileges revoked. By evening, he was escorted out through the main entrance, the public one, where visitors could see, while 73 staff members watched in silence. No rear exit courtesy. No quiet dismissal. Just a man in handcuffs ducking from a local news camera, his expensive watch catching the light one final time before the perp walk made the 6 o'clock broadcast. The investigation revealed the full scope of his institutional architecture. 6 years of falsified records. For other nurses and 2 residents destroyed. Each one had challenged a medical decision. Each one had paid for it with their career. The FBI found emails to board members containing fabricated evidence. Text messages coordinating character assassination with surgical precision. A payment to a private investigator to dig up dirt on Natalie Hayes, though the dirt he'd been paid to find had never existed outside of government databases designed to hide it. Federal charges followed: obstruction of justice, falsification of federal documents, conspiracy to defraud the federal government. The local news ran the story for 3 days straight. Decorated war hero nearly destroyed by vindictive doctor. The hospital issued a statement about its commitment to due process and supporting its staff. Pierce's attorney made comments about misunderstandings and a young doctor's overzealous approach to hospital management. No one believed him. 6 months later, Natalie drove through Savannah's morning traffic in her personal vehicle with the windows down, heat already building at 0623 hours even though the sun hadn't cleared the Georgia pines yet. Webb rode shotgun, his service medals finally transferred from the sealed envelope to a display case he kept on his bedside table at home. The unit patch, the faded one that had lived against her skin for 14 years in a jacket lining, now rested in a shadow box on his dresser. He'd asked for it. She'd given it without hesitation. His notebook sat in his lap. His pen was already moving. They passed a medical supply van parked outside a free clinic on Victory Drive, community service hours stenciled on the side in yellow letters. Pierce loaded boxes of gauze and 4 supplies with the movements of a man serving time without bars. A county corrections officer stood nearby, supervising. 800 hours of community service. Permanent revocation of medical license in Georgia. 3 years probation. His hands, which had once held the institutional power to destroy a nurse with a phone call, now held rolls of medical tape and bottles of saline. He didn't look up as they passed. Cedar Creek Medical had asked Natalie to return as Director of Emergency Medicine, a new position created specifically for her, with an office that had never existed before. She declined twice. Webb had written 1 note on his pad and handed it to her: they need someone who remembers what service means. She'd accepted the next morning. Her uniform was crisp whites now, not scrubs. The rank insignia on her collar was finely visible, captain, across both shoulders where it should have been all along. She drove through the staff lot and parked in a spot with her name on it. Webb gathered his notebook. They walked through the automatic doors together, 2 operators finally allowed to exist in the same light. 73 nurses, residents, and physicians waited for her in the morning staff meeting. She stood at the podium and tapped the microphone once. Her voice had dropped an octave from the one that had asked meekly if she should fetch supplies for Dr. Pierce. This voice gave orders. This voice had held a man's aorta steady while death waited 7 minutes away. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, she said. Let's make sure we protect them instead of breaking them. Webb tapped his notebook twice from the back row. His way of saying amen. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your actual value, you understand exactly what Natalie Hayes felt in that moment. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors among us who deserve recognition. Like this video if Captain Hayes earned her victory. And comment, would you have saved him or walked away?